Now, in the previous lecture, we were talking about the Greeks, and that took us out to about the year 300 or so. And then we kind of make a jump, um, um, at least many do, by taking us straight to this idea of the mercantilists, which emerged from about 1400 to 1776, which would be the rise of Adam Smith. So I guess the first kind of question would be is, why is there some 1100, 1200 years of separation between the Greeks and the mercantilists? Again, it wasn't that largely nothing was done. It's just that not a lot of it was written down. Or that it may have been written down, but that it was lost in libraries and whatnot, that the written documents themselves were not preserved. Regardless, what we get with the mercantilists in the start of the Middle Ages is this idea that, when the average person living in the year 1400 or 1500 had about the same standard of living as someone born in the time of Jesus Christ, meaning around the year 0. So that for 1400, 1500 years, a millennium and a half, people had not, there was no economic growth, which would be pretty unheard of today. But then something radically starts to change in the economy around the year 1400, 1500. Now, if you look at just your kind of standard economics textbook, we typically just say, well, people started holding gold, and that goldsmiths started creating money based on this gold, and that money started to be lent out, and you really had an economy that was just becoming more formalized and just really kind of took off after individuals, gold dealers, did this. And while that has some element of truth, what I'm hoping is that after this lecture, you'll see some deeper reasons why the economy grew so quickly with the mercantilists. Now, mercantilism in general, again, we get this in about the 1400s, meaning the 15th century till about the middle of the 18th century. So again, let's just, for convenience sake, say 1776. Yes, we get this rise of merchant capital, which again was my previous statement of this idea that goldsmiths started acting as bankers that were printing more money than the gold that was being held there. But that we also get the rise of the nation state. And that the nation state, what that does for us is it really emphasizes this idea that in a country, we can think of how the country as a whole is managed. And that's what gives us, when we talk about the mercantilists, we have both capitalists that are just trying to benefit themselves, but that they're also promoting the fortunes of the country as a whole. And that these things that they're doing are more practical than they are scholarly. Meaning, if we look at that previous lecture I just made about the Greeks, and we're talking about like Nicomachean ethics and living the, fulfilling one's potentiality, mercantilists don't really care about that. They want to make money and they want their country to be strong. Now, I'm not saying this to be controversial. Rather, I'm just saying, how do I work through this world as a person that knows the history of thought? I actually think that, and I don't think I'm the only one who thinks this, and if you're curious about this idea I'm about to say, well, you can Google it. I'm sure there's much smarter people than me that have said it already. is that actually Donald Trump is actually comes across as a pretty typical mercantilist. And we'll see that some of the ideas that he proposes and some of the ideas that he pushes, such as this idea of trade restrictions, such as this idea of focusing again on profit and making both private fortune as well as public fortune. Those are all mercantilist ideas. Now, the mercantilists take two approaches here. Yes, they are more practical, but what they focus on here is a doctrinal approach and a policy approach. And in the doctrinal approach, we can see that some of their writings are focusing on a cohesive, static set of ideas, which is another reason why we start to talk about the mercantilists as kind of one of our fields of economic thought after the Greeks. And what I would argue that even before Adam Smith is really the first time we get some formal economics that we would recognize today, because we do have this cohesive set of ideas. But again, their focus as well is on policy. How do you define economic and political institutions so you can understand how people work with each other? The idea, the overriding idea of what the mercantilists argue for is they want the accumulation of money, of wealth, and that you do this by accumulating precious metals, most significantly gold and silver, and that you don't allow that gold and silver to be exported. That means that all trade and all finance in the mercantilist era all centers around gold, and that gold is the measure of wealth, it's the unit of account, and it's the way that money gets to be defined. So gold is the center of the discussion for mercantilists. And what you need to do is you just need to manage that gold, and you need to keep it within the country. What it also means for the mercantilist is that besides gold and silver being the general way that we define the society, that what we also see is this idea of nationalism. And we need to, we don't want to have trade deficits or trade surpluses. We want to be strong. We want to dominate trade routes. We want to, if anything, be militaristic so that we can be powerful and we can control these trade routes. Keep the wealth within the country. But what it also means is that you push, as a country, you try to create a system where you are selling your exported goods, but you're not importing a great deal. Right? So you try to just do as much yourself and sell to others without the expectation that others are going to be, that you're going to be buying things from others. So the colonies that countries have become really important here because that's where you're going to get the raw materials rather than buying them from other countries. And that's what we see here, that this colonization and monopolization is important for colonial trade because you want these colonies to be dependent on the mother country, where those colonies give the mother country all of the natural resources, and that the colonies are then forced to buy the finished goods that are produced in the country. And so obviously that, it's not too hard to understand the beginnings of the United States, the colonies, right? Those colonies, the 13 colonies of the United States, sold their natural resources, most importantly, furs, um, agricultural goods, timber to England, and that people were then forced to buy the finished goods from England. And that, curiously enough, as well, mercantilists are also greatly against this idea of a great deal of regulation and just restriction on the movement of goods. And you want the central government to exist so that it promotes all of these mercantilist goals. So we're going to protect agricultural, mining, and manufacturing at home, and we're going to discourage it from occurring abroad where we buy those things. We're going to just try to, again, keep as much things in-house in a way to encourage international trade, but only to the extent that it benefits the home country. And that as well, what you need is you need a country that has a lot of people. You need these people to be there because you want to keep wages low. And if you keep the wages low, it actually makes your society stable as well, because then people aren't going to get paid a lot. That would mean that they have to work a lot to be able to continue to exist. And again, you have this idea of a strong military, but that's largely so that you can control. So that's largely so that you can control the trade routes. The early mercantilists, again, these are your gold, your silversmiths and your goldsmiths, where the focus is on this idea of bullionism, where essentially any transaction that's engaged in should be trying to minimize trade deficits or surpluses. And then the later ones, we get this pretty famous economist, Thomas Munn. And that's where we get this idea even of just general net exports as a whole, where imports are bad, are negative, and they can just be seen as the loss of gold and silver, where the only way that gold and silver can be retrieved back is by selling a finished good that gives you even more gold and silver than you initially put out for that resource. These trade monopolies, though, are important as well. What you get from this idea of like the British East India Company is that the idea is that you want your exports to be priced high, and you want the imports that are coming in from that colony to have a great deal less value, in a way that you're able to keep countries or colonies that are selling you the resources from being able to use that resource to become more powerful. And that the way you try to control these resources even better is by setting up a government company that's going to prevent price competition between from the sellers of the resources. So again, like your British East India Company is a trade monopoly. But multiple Western England countries, the British, the Dutch, the French, and the Spanish, all had their own trade monopolies. So you did still have quite a big deal of competition. And right, you can study then the history even of the United States, where the Dutch, for instance, take over New York, the British take over obviously a great deal of the colonies and even the Northwest Territories. The French get Louisiana and St. Louis. and the Spanish get most of the American West. And they're all competing with one another for these resources. And then obviously the dynamics of this all change when the colonies defeat the British. And then when they purchased the Louisiana Purchase from Napoleon in 1803, 1804. And, and the Dutch kind of give up on the United States, but they still profit from the United States existing by becoming the country that creates our credit internationally. What ends up happening, though, is that you get individuals like John Locke. Sorry, I misspelled that. It's got an E at the end. John Locke and David Hume, which you can kind of see here coming in the late 17th century, early 18th century, and then early 18th century to 1776, which again would be the first year you get Adam Smith. And what you see is that during this period of enlightenment, that people don't like always being at war. And even this idea of colonies is becoming a little bit antiquated. And this idea of restricting trade ends up becoming pretty expensive. And so the stage is basically set at the age of mercantilism for there to be something else, especially with this idea that's kind of most personified when you read like the works of Thomas Jefferson, with something like individual rights, right? That people are endowed by their creator with life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that those individuals have those rights rather than the state providing those rights, that people have those rights naturally. And so this is what we kind of see here. Here's our David Hume, here's our John Locke, and here's our Thomas Mun. And this will set the stage for what we're going to see in the next lecture with the physiocrats. And it's the physiocrats who helped train Adam Smith, which then gets to our first full lecture. So we're kind of leading up here a little bit more, getting a little bit closer to Adam Smith.